Welcome everyone. I'm excited to introduce today's presentation on the foundations of behavior analysis. We'll explore the core principles, philosophical assumptions, and key concepts that define this fascinating scientific discipline. Over the next few slides, we'll look at the goals of the field, its philosophical roots, main areas of practice, essential terminology, and how different types of behavioral control are distinguished. So, let's get started and dive into what makes behavior analysis both unique and important. When we talk about the truth and value of concepts, what really matters is their practical utility and effectiveness. In other words, theories and practices are judged by how well they produce meaningful and measurable changes in behavior. This is the core idea behind pragmatism, focusing on what works in real-world situations. Scientific explanations, especially in behavior analysis, should be as simple as possible but still adequate to explain the phenomena. We prefer explanations based on observable environmental events rather than hypothetical or mentalistic constructs, because what we can directly observe and measure is more reliable. Parsimony is another key principle, meaning that all behavior has identifiable causes rooted in environmental and biological factors. Events don't happen randomly. Understanding those controlling variables helps us predict and influence behavior effectively. Then we have determinism, which suggests that behavior is shaped by consequences across three levels: phylogenetic or species evolution, ontogenic, which relates to an individual's learning history, and cultural, involving societal practices. This Darwinian perspective helps us see how behaviors are either strengthened or weakened through interactions with the environment. Selectionism ties into this by explaining that behaviors are selected through consequences. Much like natural selection, behaviors that are reinforced tend to be maintained, while those that aren't tend to fade away. Now, looking at the philosophical assumptions, the first is control. That means demonstrating that by systematically manipulating variables, we can reliably produce changes in behavior. Control reflects the highest level of scientific understanding in our field. Prediction is about using observed patterns to forecast future behavior under specific conditions. When we understand environmental variables, we can anticipate how behavior might unfold. And finally, description involves systematically observing and recording behavior to identify patterns and relationships. Precise measurement and objective documentation are foundational here. They help us understand the functional properties of behavior. All these goals, description, prediction, control, are interconnected and form the scientific foundation of behavior analysis, guiding us toward a deeper understanding of behavior and how to influence it effectively. Now, let's look at the domains of behavior analytic practice. First, we have radical behaviorism, which is the philosophical foundation developed by B.F. Skinner. It emphasizes viewing behavior as a natural phenomenon, meaning everything we do can be studied scientifically. This approach recognizes both public behaviors and private events like thoughts and feelings, treating them all as behaviors subject to learning principles. Importantly, radical behaviorism rejects mentalism, which focuses on unobservable mental states, but it still incorporates cognition within a behavioral framework. Next, we move to experimental analysis of behavior, or EAB. This involves basic research in controlled lab settings, where researchers discover fundamental principles of learning and behavior. Often, non-human subjects are used to isolate variables and establish clear cause-and-effect relationships. This foundational work helps us understand how behavior works at a basic level. Then, we have translational research, which acts as the critical bridge between basic and applied research. It involves adapting laboratory findings to more natural settings, testing whether these principles hold up outside the lab. This step is crucial for ensuring that what we learn can be practically applied in real-world environments. Finally, applied behavior analysis, or ABA, is where all these principles come together in practice. Here, practitioners design and implement individualized interventions based on behavior analytic principles. They train caregivers, conduct assessments, and always adhere to ethical standards. The goal is to produce meaningful, measurable improvements across diverse populations and settings, whether in education, healthcare, or organizational contexts. This comprehensive approach ensures that behavior analysis remains effective and ethical as it addresses socially significant problems. Let's talk about the concept of maintenance, which refers to how well behavior changes stick around over time after an intervention has been withdrawn or altered. Essentially, maintenance is promoted through strategies like intermittent reinforcement schedules, which help sustain behavior, and generalization programming, which ensures that the behavior occurs in different settings. It's also important to make sure that natural contingencies in the individual's environment support the target behavior, so it becomes a part of their everyday life. Now, moving on to consequences that decrease the likelihood of a behavior happening again in the future. These are called punishers. Punishment can be positive, meaning we present an aversive stimulus to reduce the behavior, or negative, where we remove a desired stimulus. The effectiveness of punishment really depends on factors like timing, intensity, consistency, and whether there are alternative behaviors the individual can engage in instead. Next, let's clarify what we mean by punishers. These are specific stimuli or events that serve as consequences to weaken or decrease a behavior. It's important to remember that reinforcers, those consequences that strengthen behavior, are defined by their effect, not by whether someone personally likes them. What acts as a reinforcer can vary widely across different individuals and situations. Examples include food, praise, tokens, or even the opportunity to escape an unpleasant situation. Speaking of reinforcement, this is the process where a consequence increases the likelihood that a behavior will occur again in the future. Reinforcement can be positive, where you add a stimulus, or negative, where you remove one. The main idea is that the behavior becomes more frequent, lasts longer, or becomes more intense because of reinforcement. Finally, let's cover some key terminology. A stimulus is any environmental event or change that an organism can detect, and it can influence behavior either before a response occurs. These are called antecedents, or after. These are called consequences. A response is a single instance of behavior, like raising your hand. When a response happens multiple times, it's often grouped into a response class. And behavior itself refers to the observable activities and interactions between an organism and its environment, whether it's speaking, walking, or even internal processes like thinking, as long as we define them operationally. Understanding the difference between rule-governed and contingency-shaped behavior is crucial for designing effective interventions. Some skills are best learned through explicit instructions, like following rules or guidelines, while others require direct practice with real consequences, like trial-and-error learning. The most effective learning often combines both approaches strategically. Rule-governed behavior is quick to develop and can be very efficient for rapid change. However, it can also be less flexible. For example, someone might continue following an outdated rule even when the actual situation has changed, which is particularly important to consider in clinical contexts. Think about following driving directions or assembling furniture. These are classic examples of rule-based behavior that can persist even when the environment no longer supports them. On the other hand, contingency-shaped behavior develops gradually through direct contact with environmental contingencies, meaning through repeated experience with reinforcement or punishment. This type of learning tends to be more flexible and adaptable to changing conditions. For instance, riding a bicycle or navigating a familiar route. These skills develop through trial and error and are often more resistant to change once established. Both pathways, rule-governed and contingency-shaped, have their advantages and limitations. Rule-governed behavior is quick and can generalize across similar contexts, but it may be less sensitive to actual environmental changes. Contingency-shaped behavior is more flexible and rooted in real experience, but it typically takes longer to establish. By understanding these differences, we can better tailor our interventions to promote more adaptive and resilient behaviors.